have the full bios for everybody, I know, so I'll keep the introductions here brief, but we have Professor Roland Fryer, who is the Harvey Lee Professor of Economics here at Harvard, Richard Barth, CEO of KIPP, who many people know, Dr. Tiffany Anderson is the Superintendent of the Jennings School District, and Pam Cantor is the CEO of Turnaround for Children, a nonprofit which I used to serve on the board of, so it's lovely to see Pam again. Our focus is, can schools alone overcome the challenges of poverty? And so to start us off, I'd love for everybody to spend individually about 4 minutes each talking a little bit about your research and how you think about this issue generally before we get into the details. And Pam, do you want to start?
Sure. I was allowed 2 slides. What? I don't think they're there yet. Are they there? Okay. One of the stories that I want to talk to you about today is about science and the particular way in which science shapes a very optimistic story about human potential. Even human potential when the start in life is characterized by a lot of adversity. So I want to plant one idea first. We all, as individuals, have 25,000 genes in our genome, yet less than 1% of those genes gets expressed. Why is that? What determines which parts of our genome gets expressed? That story is the story about how our developing brains are formed. And they are formed by relationships, they're formed by experiences that children have. As mammals, a lot of our brain develops after we're born. If the relationships and experiences in kids' lives are rich, then they thrive. But if they are filled with stress, if they're filled with the stress that comes from adversity, something else happens. Because adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. Children under chronic stress, without the benefit of a human buffer, are exposed to high levels of cortisol that bathe their brains and bodies. And cortisol heads for 2 primary systems. It heads for the limbic system, which is the learning center of the developing brain, and it heads for the immune system, which governs the health of our children. So it's not an accident that children in poverty struggle with learning and behavioral problems, and they struggle with health problems. And the literature and research on this is the literature about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And those studies, which is big data at this point, say that if you have greater than 4 ACEs, the likelihood that you will have learning and behavioral problems in school goes up astronomically, and the likelihood that you will have chronic health problems. So let's go a little bit more micro as to how that happens. When cortisol hits the limbic system, it is hitting a system with 3 structures. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in organization and many, many different learning functions around attention and control. The hippocampus, which is involved with memory, and the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional smoke detector. And what that means is the amygdala remembers stress. It remembers stress to the point that if children have high levels of unbuffered stress, that structure grows at the expense of other structures. And we now know that from brain imaging studies. But the thing about this picture is that it could sound really negative. But it isn't a negative story for a whole other set of reasons, and that is that children's brains are malleable, and they're malleable into early adulthood. And on top of that, there is another hormonal system called the oxytocin system, which is the love hormone. And that system opposes cortisol. So when we think of relationship and connection and trust, We're thinking of something that actually happens at the neurobiological level and in fact protects children from the impact of adversity. So one of the things we asked ourselves at Turnaround was, how do children become fully engaged and responsive learners? Because if you could articulate a path for how they become learners, maybe I would know how to click and we would do, okay. If we could, the way that we teach literacy, the way that we teach numeracy, we teach it in stages. What if the development of critical co-academic skills for success followed the same kind of developmental path? What if we could intentionally build the skills that you see on this framework? We read the literature on this, and that framework wasn't something we created. The framework emerged from the literature. Take a look at the bottom 2 rows and look at attachment, self-regulation, stress modulation. We think of those skills as skills that children develop between 0 and 5. But when we look at turnaround schools and the children in our persistently underperforming schools, this is where they struggle. They come into kindergarten without these skills fully formed. And then when you look at readiness for school, the 3rd row, and you look at growth mindset and sense of purpose, do I see myself as a student? Children who have been exposed to high levels of adversity don't have that. So our K-12 system is oriented based on an assumption that's actually false. That children have these fundamental skills when they come into kindergarten, they don't. And they aren't intentionally promoted as part of K-12 education. So the case that I want to make for you, and I was thinking of this, all throughout the morning's presentation, is that if every one of our systems developed those skills, not just schools, but definitely schools, woven into pedagogy, then we would actually be developing in our kids most at risk, the co-academic skills that any of them would need to be a successful learner and successful in their lives.
So let's,
I know it was long.
no, it's okay. Let's go to Richard, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about how you've seen those ideas implemented, but you certainly have experienced that throughout the system of KIPP schools, and talk about your own experience and how you've dealt with it.
So, and I want, just for fun, I know looking at the theme for today and looking at the desire to have Twitter trending, when I got the invitation, I thought they're going to want me to say, yes, schools can overcome on their own poverty, so we could all tweet that and then get a trend. I'm not going to say it, and I know people think I might want to.
Roland might say it.
But I will. Like here's our. I do want to put this out there because I do think, having just heard John speak, and I think in terms of the optimism, and there's so many reasons for optimism. Like we are, I think, heading towards a more integrated way of thinking about it, and less into this idea of it's a dichotomy. Whether that dichotomy is about K-12 versus workforce, K-12 versus college, whether it's about socio-emotional learning and traditional academics. For us, I would want to make sure people, from our experience, our take has been, what's not helpful about the debate is that if you go into schools where we live with teachers and families and kids and you say, poverty wins, it can be pretty dispiriting to all these people who have a lot of work to do. And if you say poverty wins all the time, you can imagine people might throw their hands up. Say, okay, well, what's my job? Particularly if you're one of our kids, one of our families. And on the other hand, if you go into schools and say, schools can win this on their own, like you can do this, you can have the alternative reality, which is people say, look, you're not accounting for the fact that there's so much upstream work our kids and families are facing every day just to stay even. And so we basically think there's just a pragmatic way to think about this, and that is that poverty really matters. Schools have a ton of time. As we heard today, it's not 24 hours, but we do have, depending on the length of your day, 7, 8, 9 hours with our kids that we can make the most of. And at the same time, we shouldn't operate as silos. So just if I said, like, what's big learnings on this? If you operate as a silo, you get these kind of debates. and you get the idea that people think you can pull this off purely in a 7.5-hour day doing what you do. Where we have made the most progress in our learnings of the last few years is recognizing that, just as John White said, if it's ultimately about kids having access to the American dream, access to opportunity, access to employment with benefits, we have to think of K-12 as not K-12, but K to ever, right? Not even K-16, K forever. We're entering a world where learning will never end, and we have to take into account what engages kids, both in the traditional academic system that people think about, and the traditional academic skills we think about, and we have to think about what keeps kids coming back day after day. And we have to create environments that are structured, that are safe. The number one thing our families do tell us, they want safe and structured and nurturing. When we do that, our kids keep coming back to us. We have low attrition. Kids want to be with us. Our kids who have lots of different challenges and opportunities have the opportunity to pursue different paths to discover what they're passionate about. And then we're creating lifelong, a pathway of opportunity afterwards. So I wish I could be the provocative one to say it doesn't, that schools can do it alone. They can't. Our biggest learning has been to keep schools focused on the fact that you can make a huge difference in your time. Don't let ourselves be isolated. And happy to go into detail about any aspect of what it means to break down that isolation from the standpoint of healthcare to higher ed to workforce.
Dr. Anderson.
I'll give a 3-minute piece and perhaps even shorter so that we really can get engaged in the questions. And so that you know Jennings, for those that don't know Jennings, we border Ferguson. We are 100% free lunch, 98% African-American students. And in July, I'll be the first African-American female in Topeka, Kansas, where the landmark case for Brown v. Board took place, which has a 70%. Thank you. And so a couple of things. And I just naturally speak fast, so I'm going to try to slow down. But I want you to get as much as you can about practicality and how this thing works and what it looks like. When you leave, outside, you'll see our homeless shelter on the front. Any student that is homeless, we ensure that they have a place to stay in our district, and there's an article on that. And then there are a handful of articles about ways to work with kids in poverty and really what it looks like in our district. So here's the first thing. Schools aren't alone. Schools are never alone. The problem is people think that schools are alone, and therefore they approach the problem as if they're alone, or they act like they're a silo. And because of that, they struggle in ways that they don't have to. There's this uncommon sense about how you can approach kids and how you can approach schools. And the first thing is relationships. Kids will learn for you if they trust you. They won't if they don't. A lot of it goes back to medical science. For us, it's just a matter of building trust in ways that are unconventional. Same with people that work for you as well. And so the way that we've approached this, and we really rely on 3 things: relationships, pedagogy, and curriculum, the relationships being the most important. And so we spend a great deal of time building that in creative ways. And as this discussion continues, I can give you some practical pieces. And so once you realize that schools aren't alone and that people want to help and that there's tremendous power in the classroom, it changes everything you do. In St. Louis, Jennings will be the first school district that is in St. Louis that's a trauma-informed school district. We have 100% free lunch, remember, but we have a 93% graduation rate and 100% of our students are placed. Most people would say that's not possible, but it is. Literally 100% placed. And so graduation is Thursday, and this placement for us, either they're placed in a post-secondary area, so that's college or the military, or they're placed in a job that leads to a career. But the idea is that we have a responsibility, as do you, to ensure that we support schools in ways that they don't feel like they're alone, and that they recognize that there are so many ways to overcome the challenges that poverty presents. And there are a great deal of challenges. And in Jennings, we start at birth. It's a beautiful thing. When you get pregnant, you now know we have a baby college, and we'll be in your home to help you with prenatal care and ensure that you enter school. And if you get pregnant while you're at school, we have another teen parent pregnancy center. It's not an option to be or feel alone or to fail. It just simply is not if you live in Jennings. And so we'll be replicating this in my fourth place, and now this will be Topeka. And that will be a little different because they're not used to seeing someone necessarily that looks like me leading this work. And there are a lot of skeptics about what's possible. So I'll stop there and save the rest for the questions later.
All right, Roland?
Thanks. Thank you for having me. This is going far too well, so let me see what I can do. I assume this is why you had me. Look, I think it's obvious that schools can close the racial achievement gap. The question is whether or not the racial achievement gap then translates into higher income and closing the income gap and the unemployment gaps that come later in life. All right, so let's just slow down for a second. Let's talk about where the facts are and where the experiments are. Let's just talk about charter schools for a second. Richard, feel free to interrupt me. The average charter school is actually no better than the average public school. But there are amazing charter schools, and there's some that if we weren't here today, we should go shut them down now. Okay? But from an economist perspective, there's lots of variance. And variance is good if you want to understand a problem. Okay? And so, I don't know, 7 years ago, I called Richard up and I said, hey, we should figure out what makes some charters like KIPP do amazing things for some of the poorest minority students in the country, and other charters, which I'll try not to name, are not doing so well. And essentially, I won't bore you with the details, but we gathered a bunch of data. We spent 2 years in great charter schools and 2 years in not so great charter schools, and we figured out 5 things that were correlated with predicting which ones were good and predicting which ones were not so good. Okay? So those things are like more time. It's the basic physics of education. If you're behind, then you either need to spend more time in school or tell the people who are in front of you, could you please take Thursday and Friday off? Okay? So it's time. The second is how you do human capital, which is teachers and principals and things like that. The third is, thinking about how you use data to really drive instruction. These are all obvious things. The fourth is tutoring, putting kids in, I guess you call them small learning communities, but I'm from the South, so it's just really tutoring. You can call it whatever the hell you want. It's tutoring. And then the fifth thing really is culture and high expectations. I think those things are absolutely essential, right? I grew up dirt poor. I didn't realize until I got here to Harvard. Someone's like, you were poor? I was like, oh, that kind of sucks. I didn't realize that. My grandmother never used those terms. Apparently, we just didn't need it. At any rate, speaking of which, I know these 5 things are kind of obvious, but they explain 50% of the variance of why some charter schools are good and others are not. And you might say, 50% is not that large, but if I could explain 50% of the daily fluctuations of the stock market, I wouldn't know you, okay? So I remember telling my grandmother, she taught for 37 years English language arts in 6th grade. She integrated schools in Florida in 1969. And this woman is it's weird to call your grandmother kind of the love of your life, but this woman was so my person. She passed away 2 years ago. And I remember we got tired of talking about neighborhood gossip where I grew up, and so she asked me what I did for a living. And I was telling her I was trying to figure out what makes some schools good and other schools not so good. And I gave her the 5 things, trying to impress her. And my grandmother said, baby, they pay you for that shit. Not much, Grandma. Not much. So, okay, those 5 things. Now, we took those. Now, those are correlations, right? So correlations are kind of interesting. They become more interesting with data visualization. But as we know as social scientists, correlations aren't enough. We need causality. So all the things that we're talking about on these panels so far have been correlations. What we need to do is how do you do this in an experiment, right? If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, I think these pills might work, people who took them kind of, I don't know, you'd run out of there. You want a randomized controlled trial. Okay, so that's what we did. We took these 5 things, we went to Houston and other places since, but I'll talk about Houston. And we put these in 20 of randomly chosen of the lowest 40 performing schools in Houston. Okay, so we got exciting, dedicated new principals. We put in the tutoring programs, all the stuff that the 5 things from the successful charters told us we needed to do. In the elementary schools, we closed the achievement gap in 3 years. In the middle schools and high schools, it was done in 5 years. of the 3 years that the experiment, last 3 years the experiment ran in the high schools, 100% of the kids were accepted to a 2 or 4 year university, college or university. So you can close the achievement gap. I'm quite confident that that can happen. What I'm not confident in is what happens after that. And we have new results coming out from some looking at long-term effects of some of the most successful charters. And the striking finding is that wages aren't going up, right? And so I don't know if that means we need to redo and rethink our pedagogy. I don't know if it means we need to work on some of those skills that Pam was talking about in terms of grit and growth mindset. Those things are tough. Hell, we don't even know how to measure them, much less like figure out how to influence them. Or that things like networks and neighborhoods matter even more potentially than test scores. I don't know. Those are, but I think that's where the frontier, where the set of questions are. We can certainly close the racial achievement gap. Can we do it on scale in every school? That's a separate question. I don't know the answer to that. But it can be done. We have many proofs of concept. The question now is, can we translate that, and does that translate into labor markets and things like that? And we just don't know. It's too early to tell.
So, you know, underperforming schools, I have found, invest in programs and not systems. Programs come and go. They come and go with the leader. They come and go with the money. So the first thing I will tell you is I don't believe in programs. I believe in systems because that'll be sustainable. And whether it's Montgomery County, where I was superintendent, 7 schools were accredited when I got there. Within a couple of years, 16, by 4 years, all 23 were accredited. That system remained for years after I left. University Academy, it's the top performing in charter in Kansas City where I was. Underperforming, it is still accredited with distinction, and I've been gone 4 years. Systems can be replicated, and so when I talk about relationships, pedagogy, curriculum, just so we're clear on even what that is, pedagogy is who's in front of the students and what are they teaching them. You give me more time with a bad teacher, that's not going to help me. So time is important. We're in school Monday through Saturday. We have 8 hours a day in some of our buildings within Jennings. But it's creating the system itself, saying, okay, in our case, and in all the places I've been, relationships, pedagogy, curriculum, let's tackle those things. Trauma matters, poverty matters, early childhood matters. So then why in the world are we not investing in that? And we cannot say because the state isn't doing it. It's our responsibility, if you were the leader of the system, to redirect dollars to address those things. I mean, we know what kids need to improve. And so you develop that platform from when you begin. I will give a little pushback in the sense of I do think race and poverty play an interconnected role. And I do believe that you can go to the same college and leave and and apply for the same job, even submit the same application. And if my name is of an African sounding name, I might not get that job with that same application with another name. Poverty and race do go hand in hand, and I do believe that. And so it's really about breaking this cycle of oppression and empowering young people and understanding the system that they are in that is perpetuating this cycle and how to empower them with skills to get beyond that. So some of it's the academic piece, getting into college. Also some of it's understanding issues of social justice for us and asking the right questions. And so the curriculum is an aligned standards-based curriculum. If you're a poor district and can't buy anything, that's fine. You don't necessarily need the books. Just understand the standards and stop teaching to the test and teach to the standard. I mean, it really is pretty simple. You don't ever have to use a book in Jennings. I don't care. Just teach to the standard and teach mastery. 80% of mastery, you'll still learn it. And then relationship speaks for itself, but that's the number one thing. With your teachers, and remember, some teachers are also traumatized. And then they're in the classroom where they're then repeated trauma. And so, just understanding that. And so I give you the example so you understand how does this work within a system. So you don't leave with this broad piece, but you don't understand practical kinds of just things that all of you can do. So a system is important. Systematic improvement is important. And if you don't invest in creating a system, despite who the leader is, it will not be sustainable. To me, what you're asking, when you say is this scalable, it's really, can we change the mindsets of a lot of people? Yes, we can. It happens all the time in scary ways and maybe not so scary ways. And so even as you look at our current political climate, can you transform it? Your only barrier is you, literally, is how you think. That's our only barrier. And so once you, even people, and this sounds a little different than some superintendents, some people talk about resources. Resources, first of all, will always be small. Standards will always be high. So if you're whining about resources, you'll never improve at high levels. Resources will always be small. I look at it as an opportunity and a challenge, and it's wonderful that in Jennings we don't have anything, because then we can show that you can do something even when you have literally nothing, when schools teach you that you're poor. And so this idea, is it scalable? Absolutely. And it's so interesting to me because I was assistant superintendent, 23,000 students. Achievement gap began closing in a very short period of time. I left, it continued. It had nothing to do with me. It's changing how people think. Montgomery County continued. Then people said, oh, it's because it's Virginia Tech. Okay, charter, because it's charter, you have flexibility. Jennings, because it's Jennings, it's small. I mean, no matter where I go, I don't know what they'll say with Topeka. 14,000 kids, it's diverse, and I'm not sure what they'll say, but I'm sure there'll be a reason. I wonder what if, just a thought on the political end. Here's just an example. You know, we have SIG schools, schools improvement, focus schools, priority schools. That's the way the system is set up. The system is set up to reward you the worse you do. Literally, you'll get millions of dollars if you're the bottom 5% in your state. As soon as we started improving in Jennings, all of that money, we lost it, millions. Once we became accredited, no longer will they pay for preschool. So we pay for a lot of these things through our general budget, through partners, isn't that crazy? You're rewarded for failure. That is the current system that we live in. And so it's up to you, one, to take the veil off your eyes and to see what reality is, and then to change mindsets. And you can do that. So, you know, when people get into the power in telling the story is great because people see what we're doing and they know they can replicate and they know possibility. But it's important to know I didn't make this happen. The people in Jennings did. All I did was help show a road to making it happen. Imagine all of the great leaders that you think of, Martin Luther King and all these other folks, if they passed away or left and said, oh, I can't do this anymore, that'd be crazy. So I think teachers, great teachers, they leave. At University Academy, you had teachers that were leaving every few years, and guess what? They're still performing, and they're still accredited with distinction. I think great teacher leaders and academic leaders can build systems, have it sustainable, transition, replicate that, and other leaders come in. On a very side note, now I'll kind of just throw this out there and then be quiet. I will leave to Topeka. So people say, who's going to lead Jennings? Is it a great person? Who is it? I don't know. Born has to pick them, but it's going to be a great person. And you know what? Because the community won't accept anything less. That's why. And if they accept anything less, shame on you. Because we have now taken a district that's been lost accreditation decades ago that's now accredited, meeting 81% of the standards, 93% graduation rate. Shame on you if you accept anything less. Now, here's what I will do. We induct teachers by bringing teachers and having them pair up with other teachers. So the assistant superintendent position that is vacant, we'll leave it vacant so when you hire the new person, they can start 3 months early. I've been training this young man now for the last 2 months. He's learning the system. So July 1, he'll be good to go. Why isn't that possible? That's so possible. So, y'all, we can do this thing. That's the message.
So let me ask you a question that really, nobody may be equipped to deal with, but one I think we all think about a lot and get frustrated with, which is the political will piece. What can any of us do on that front?
Okay, since I talk the most, then I'm just going to throw this on out there. Well, and I think, so on this campaign trail, Hillary Clinton came to Ferguson, and so myself and 3 or 4 other people, sat on the stage, and we were talking about social justice, and Mike Brown, and Mike's siblings live in our, live in our district, and so. And you know what? I was there, finished crossing guard duty. I'm there in my tennis shoes, and I just, said what I'm saying here. We know what it takes to work with kids. We know what we need to be investing. The farther you are from the classroom, the less you know what you're talking about when it comes to kids. I mean, the farther you are from the schools, the less you know. And so that would be anybody that is not directly in schools and classrooms. And so, so I think we can voice the things that we need to voice. I think action speaks so much louder. And so our story is compelling in that it is showing that these things are possible, but there are obstacles that are unnecessarily put in our way. And the more that we can continue to share that and show that, the more important it will be. Also bringing people to the table. Now, you know, Hillary Clinton, Arne Duncan, all these people have come to the table in part because of Ferguson, and we border Ferguson. I don't care why they come to the table. When they come to the table, it's still sharing, here's what we do, and whether they listen to that and take that, whether it was any other political candidate, Donald Trump, it doesn't matter who it is. At the end of the day, I'm not wrapped up in whether a politician chooses to, for whatever reason, listen or not listen. I'm really more wrapped up in how we will serve our children despite those that choose to put barriers. I still, for the life of me, can't understand the model in which we reward failure and take funds from schools that improve. I don't understand that. I can voice it, but at the end of the day, we have to work around it. So building political will just continues to transform minds and ask people to, bring voice to power and to the extent that they can.
Look, I think the political will is growing, but it ain't growing fast enough. And the panel's almost over. Let me be very straight with you. I'm angry. I am so angry at where we are. Like, I love this country, don't get me wrong. My story is only possible here. When I had the great pleasure of meeting Mr. Obama for the first time when he was in office, I hugged him and I said, only in America can a guy like me meet the President of the United States. And I really do mean that. I mean, this is a wonderful, wonderful country. And we'll do and achieve everything we want to do. The question we have to ask ourselves is if we really want to solve this problem. Because if we don't, I'd like to do what some of those other tenured professors do. Nothing. But if we're going to solve it, then let's get busy about solving it. Right? Kids are not going to get fourth grade back. I got a 3-year-old and another one due in 6 weeks. They're growing up right here off of Brattle Street. They're going to be fine. But where I grew up, it's the same old stuff. And the successful charters aren't in Daytona Beach, Florida. And those kids have a high likelihood of being in prison if they don't get educated. And you know what? There's a lot of stuff to go around. I mean, we haven't even talked about this, but you know, you go to a place like D.C. Sorry. You go to a place like D.C. and 10% of the kids are reading at grade level. And 95% of the parents say the school is either good or great. That can't happen either. So we need to educate people about what they should be expecting out of this system. Right? Forget standard deviations and test scores. What about likelihoods of going to prison? What about the things of whether or not you're going to be employed or underemployed? So there's a lot of things that we can do. And I have to say, like, folks like Richard and Jeff Canada and other people throughout the years have really held me up because, you know, I'm kind of still an angry guy. And sometimes I would call people like Jeff Canada, I'd say, is the sky blue? And Jeff Canada would say, yeah, Roland, it's blue. Because in this thing that we do, people tell you stuff that's so wrong all the time, you can start looking at stuff and feel like it's something else. This problem is not insurmountable. We can definitely do it. It's just that the wrong kids got the wrong disease. If it were our kids that were in this, if it was my daughter's school that was suffering like this, my wife would figure this out in like in the morning. I'm not joking. She would just like kick out all the teachers and teach everything herself. Hope she's not watching. The question really is about, do we really think that all kids can learn? Not do we kind of say it in some meditation on our way to work. The question is, do you really fundamentally believe that? Do you really believe that that kid who grows up in the housing projects in New York has just as much cognitive potential as the kids who grow up on the Upper West Side? Do you fundamentally believe that? I wrote a paper about 9-month-olds, and we found out that there was no racial difference in the test scores of 9-month-olds. I got a couple superintendents who I really like. Sent me an email saying, "You don't really believe that, do you?" Do we fundamentally believe that? Because if we do, then we'll do all the things needed to fix this problem. We'll actually hold the politicians accountable. Screw around and invade the wrong country, you get kicked out of office pretty quick. Don't do anything on the racial achievement gap or the income achievement gap, you can stay in office. So the question is, the voters, us, people who put people in office, are we willing to hold them accountable? Are we willing to educate the parents in these schools of what they can expect so they can hold their elected officials accountable? Are we willing to do what we know we should do for kids who are not ours and who may not look like ours? And you don't have to say it out loud, but that's the really, I'm sorry to say it, that's the fundamental question. And if you truly believe that there but for the grace of God go my children, we'll fix it tomorrow morning. I'll show you.
We were going to wrap it up at 3:15, so we don't have time for questions. I'm sorry, but I think that was a great way to end. Please thank our panel again. Roland and